name is Jake Werner. I'm the director of the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute. I focus on U.S.-China relations, particularly economic aspects of the conflict and developing policy to try to stabilize the relationship.
Focusing on U.S. grand strategy toward East Asia, particularly with Korea. Korea, we have a lot of issues to look at always, including North Korea and how South Korea's positioning between the U.S. and China.
I'm going to start the questions, and I will start from the summit, the U.S. and China summit.
Usually the summit accomplishes more than what the summit accomplished. So I think one thing is just the lack of preparation, how distracted the United States was. But there was an agenda framed, and it had to do especially with economic issues. The United States and China agreed to set up a board of trade and a board of investment to try to manage these aspects of the relationship, and it removed some of the tensions that have been plaguing the relationship economically for many years. So I think probably the most fundamental thing is just that it confirmed stability in the relationship by continuing an atmosphere of calm that was established at Busan last year when Xi Jinping and Trump met each other. And that maybe is an accomplishment all on its own, given how chaotic and conflictual the relationship between the US and China was last year.
And at the summit, Washington and Beijing reached an agreement to work together toward building the so-called, constructive relationship of strategic stability. And the US readout didn't really define what this means. And the Chinese readout provided, I guess, a more detailed definition of the concept, but it is still unclear what the concept, would look like in practice. So I think some US allies and partners, particularly those that have conflictual relationship with China, like Japan and Philippines, they could worry that, this vision might lead to some sort of, bilateral bargain between Xi and Trump. I think there were some concerns before the summit. So, and how that kind of bargain could undermine their own interests vis-a-vis China. But likewise, Russia and North Korea also could wonder, looking at the concept, just wondering what that means and how that could affect their own interests. And according to the Chinese readout, Trump and Xi exchanged views on a range of global regional issues, including situations in the Middle East, Ukraine, and the Korean Peninsula too, as Jake mentioned. And I'm sure both Putin and Kim Jong-un sort of, wonder what views were exchanged and between Xi and Trump, and perhaps looking for Xi's reassurance that their own interests won't be compromised for that kind of future deal between US and China. So that's why I don't think it's coincidence at all that Xi is having consecutive summits with Putin right after Trump and potentially with Kim next week. And by doing so, China is sort of able to present itself as sort of a hub for regional diplomacy and also, clearly demonstrated geopolitical influence. So yeah, that's sort of my initial take.
Constructive strategic stability. What does it mean? What's inside in it? And what do you think? Especially, I'm thinking of the United States.
When you have a term that's so vague and open-ended, and it could be filled with all kinds of different meanings, that helps coordinate. The two sides can agree on something, but they can each have their own definition of it. And it's not until you get to a practical discussion, concrete negotiations, that any tensions will come out of that. I think that this is, at some level, this is just semantics. It's just rhetoric. It's not substantive. It doesn't matter in that sense. But in terms of framing the possibility of negotiations, I think it's very helpful. Mm-hmm. One of the big disagreements between the U.S. and China during the Biden administration really wanted to insist that we are engaged in a great power competition. Mm-hmm. And China's perspective on that was, and I think this makes sense from the U.S. side, that China is rising quickly. The United States wants to make sure that it is sort of competing across the full range of economic and military issues. And this was the way that the Biden administration framed the relationship for its domestic audience. But China was very nervous about this. And they would talk to each other, and China would say consistently, we don't think it's a competitive relationship. We think, in fact, that the competitive relationships are against the trend of the times, and that actually we should be focusing on cooperation. The Biden administration didn't want to do that. I think what the Chinese side was nervous about was when the United States starts thinking about strategic competition, it turns the relationship into a zero-sum contest. And that means that any progress for China would be considered threatening to the United States side, and that is how it played out. So now in this most recent formulation, if you look at the Chinese write-up, China has accepted that competition is a part of this relationship. So that's something of a concession to the U.S. side. But they're also really emphasizing that, and you say that China wanted to add the constructive part. They want to emphasize that there is still room for both countries to exist, and there's still room for them to work together, and that's kind of where the constructive side comes in. So China wants to continue to improve its international position, expand its economy, gain in status and influence in the global system. It doesn't want the United States to consider these things threatening to the United States, because then the United States will act to limit it in ways that could lead to open conflict. So I think that even though the formulation seems very kind of hazy and maybe it doesn't matter, or maybe it's sort of concealing something that means something different, I think rather this is just a framework in which the two sides can actually start talking about things that might be in the interest of both countries. And I think that's a step forward. So there is an opening here if the two sides can proceed to more concrete negotiation.
Do you think that kind of China? You mentioned that China's stance about this relationship has been evolved a little bit from Biden administration to Trump administration.
I think they recognize that the United States that they can't convince the United States that it's not competitive, and so they're willing to accept that. But they want to balance it. They want to have the sense that there is a possibility for stability and for progress, for win-win cooperation between the two sides. And so if they can incorporate both sides of that, then they will accept it. I think they basically, at some level, Chinese leadership thinks that the United States means to prevent China from growing and gaining in power. And most of what they're doing is trying to reckon with that. But they don't want that to become the overwhelming focus of the relationship because of how destabilizing and how it could lead into serious conflict.
Do you think that is caused by the confidence, the growth of confidence of China, or has it affected by the stance of Trump administration towards China?
China is definitely more confident now than it was 2 years ago. And in part that's because of the ways that the United States has been damaging itself and disrupting its alliances and disrupting the global economy. But I think more than anything it's because after Liberation Day last year in April, when China was the only country that stood up to the United States and said, we reject this, we're going to retaliate in kind, and that led to this spiral of tariffs on both sides that threatened to destroy the entire economic relationship between the U.S. and China because the tariffs went so high. China responded, it held its ground, in addition to raising tariffs against the United States, it imposed restrictions on the export of rare earth elements that threatened to shut down production in the United States because of the need for magnets primarily. And that led Trump to back down. And so the tariff escalation was drawn back to where it started. And that was the point at which Trump started to speak to China from a position of respect and equality. Because up to that point, Trump had basically refused to talk to China and had said, we're going to raise tariffs on you because you're not cooperating on fentanyl. China said, well, we would like to cooperate on fentanyl, we can do this, this, this. And the United States didn't respond. So it was only after China had showed its power that Trump came and started to talk to them in sort of a normal diplomatic way. And I think that's where the confidence comes, is that up until this point, from the first Trump administration across the Biden administration, the United States had been imposing restriction after restriction on China, and the United States was confident that it could continue to do that without damaging itself. And China, over that period, had been developing a series of countermeasures, a legal regime, institutional apparatus to impose retaliation for those kinds of attacks, restrictions on exports, tariffs, and other attacks on Chinese interests in other countries. And just at the very end of the Biden administration, and then particularly in response to Liberation Day last year, China used that whole system that it had been putting together, and it worked. From the Chinese perspective, it worked well. And it brought the United States back to the table. It led to de-escalation, and now the United States, I think they assume, the United States understands that it can't unilaterally harm China in the way that the United States had been doing up to that point. So I think that gives China the sense that it has confidence, it has tools that it can use to respond, and it can hold the United States in check from these kinds of economic attacks. And then on that basis, maybe there's something that the two countries could do together.
You mentioned that China has more detailed information about what stability
Right.
means. I think they have the 4 pillars for
Yes,
that.
yes.
And how did you interpret that 4 pillars?
I think to sum it up, China, as Jake said, accepted the US notion that this relationship is, competition in a way. But at the same time, when you look at the Chinese definition, it clearly says competition with limitations, like clear limitations, and also competition that respects each other's core interests.
So what does it mean? That also made me so curious. What is it? Core interest? What kind of core interest do you think they are pursuing in this term?
And when you look at the Chinese readout, and also before the summit, Chinese side already made it clear that Taiwan
yes.
would be at the top of the agenda. And when you look at the Chinese readout, there's a long paragraph about the Taiwan issue and just laying out clearly Chinese position. That's sending some sort of message to the U.S.
China is pretty clear about its core interests. Core interests are sovereignty and territorial integrity, the security of the political regime, and the right to economic development. And it thinks that the United States has challenged all of these in various ways over the years. The Taiwan issue is under the sovereignty and territorial integrity heading. The restrictions, the export restrictions, and various attempts to prevent China from gaining technologically, that's under the economic development category. And of course the United States, whenever it criticizes Chinese authoritarianism or human rights abuses or whatever, that falls under the security of the political regime. So those are the things that China has in mind. It doesn't want the United States challenging it on those core interests. And then if there are other tension points, those are things that can be tolerated and talked about, but these core interests should be off limits, according to China. But they do feel like they have now ways to respond if the United States is attacking these core interests. But I think it should also be noted that in general, in the U.S.-China relationship, China has been cautious and restrained in the way that it has responded, and it has not, up to this point, tried to use the leverage that it does have to gain concessions from the United States. It's using that leverage to prevent the United States from pushing further in ways that damage China's interests. It's not saying if you don't cut off weapon sales to Taiwan, then we're going to cut off your rare earth elements. So China's not doing that. It's just trying to make sure that the United States doesn't continue in the direction of damaging the right to development, damaging these other kind of core interests in a very serious way.
Yeah, may I move to the Taiwanese issue again? Because Mr. Xi presidency started with fairly assertive term about Taiwan during the meeting, because it hasn't been finished yet, and they sent the message to the world. Okay, Taiwan is our top priority to the world. And did you anticipate this kind of event happening during this summit?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Because what happened at the Busan summit is that the focus was on these economic issues and trying to establish this economic truce. And Taiwan was either not mentioned at all, or it was a very minor part of these discussions. And so that was in late October last year. And then in December, the United States completed the largest arms sale to Taiwan on record. And so the feeling on the Chinese side was this was we should have raised Taiwan at the Busan summit, and as a result, we ended up with this. China objects to the arms sales themselves, but it also objects symbolically to the size of that weapons sale, because it sends a signal that the United States supports the Lai Ching-te government. So China is extremely sensitive to these sort of symbolic factors. And so I think they were determined this time. Taiwan is going to be front and center. We're going to make clear to the United States that this continues to be our top priority. That didn't, just because we didn't talk about it last time doesn't mean that we have changed anything about that. And you need to find a better way of dealing with. So I don't think that China is demanding that the United States stop weapons sales, but there is now under consideration a large weapons sale to Taiwan that would be even larger than this record-breaking one from late last year, something that is, again, a record-breaking deal that sends from China's perspective, sends a particular signal about Taiwan's status. I don't get that impression, no. I don't think so. I suspect he just wasn't paying attention. I mean, he's very busy. He has a lot of different crises that he's created. So he probably wasn't tracking it. He doesn't care very much about the security side of the relationship. He cares much more about the economic side of the relationship and maybe the diplomatic dynamics that kind of show who's in charge. And so I suspect there are a lot of people who are very hawkish towards China in the administration and who are very happy to put together large arms sale deals. And probably he just wasn't tracking it. I hope that he's not trying to use it in that way. I think that would be destabilizing to use arms sales as some kind of bargaining chip. I'm sure he is thinking about it, but one consideration here is not just how China responds or what he could get out of China for it, but also how U.S. domestic politics responds, how Congress responds, how other Republicans respond. And I think to permanently shut off the sale of arms to Taiwan or to cancel this one under consideration that has already been approved by Congress, that there would be a huge backlash domestically. So it's something that he's happy to entertain all kinds of ideas that are unconventional and that other people think are terrible ideas or crazy ideas or whatever. He will consider, I think, almost anything. But I think he also has to balance these questions out. And so I don't expect any kind of sharp change in the way that the United States has been conducting itself with respect to.
If you could bet on these scenarios, and what would be your expectation from the United States decision about the next arms sale?
I think they'll probably go forward with it, but go forward with it quietly, and I think maybe break it up into different pieces, and once you balance out all of these considerations, you can sort of show that you're respecting China without thereby upending the entire relationship with Taiwan. I think that would be the wise way to do it, and the administration will, I think, aside from Trump, people in the Pentagon, people in the State Department, they will want to maintain a strong relationship with Taiwan, and will be reminding Trump that if he breaks the relationship in some way, that's going to have a very negative response from Congress and from U.S. sort of politics in general.
What is your guess about why why President Xi Jinping didn't raise the issue of Taiwan last year's summit in Busan? Was there any kind of issues, any kind of reasons?
I think there was a sense on the Chinese side that Taiwanese politics had been going against China's preferences for a long time, and it was starting to move towards China's preferences because President Lai had pursued these recall elections to try to cement control over the legislature, and he had failed in that. President Lai, as the Chinese government thinks, President Lai wants independence, and they refused to talk to him. So the fact that he was facing setbacks, there was difficulty moving the military budget through the legislature. I think it felt like on the Chinese side, things are going well for us. We don't want to, raising this with Trump is probably not going to lead to anything positive. Even if Trump wanted to make some agreement with us that we liked, we don't trust Trump. He doesn't keep his agreements. Even if he did make the agreement, there would be this backlash in American politics. So what are we going to get out of it if we really start talking seriously about it? Probably nothing, and it might be counterproductive. So I think they just set it aside. They wanted to focus on stabilizing the economic relationship, and then subsequently they regretted that because of this arms sale.
Mm-hmm. Maybe add a few more points, Jake, on the arms sale issue. I don't think China was expecting to use this summit to reverse the arms sales issue. I think by prioritizing the Taiwan issue for this summit, I think China's focus was more on the overall direction of U.S. policy toward Taiwan that it was feeling sort of more suspicious of. In last November, Xi didn't raise the Taiwan issue, as you mentioned, and then we look at what happened. November, NSS describing Taiwan as a vital strategic location within the first island chain. That kind of description of Taiwan was never seen before in the previous US NSS before, And NSS also didn't mention US One China policy. Instead, it was framed in a more vague way, like we remain committed to the long-standing US policy toward Taiwan. So from Chinese perspective, there were many aspects just the Trump administration approach toward Taiwan that it could find suspicious, And similar with the NDS2 from January. The trend line from Chinese perspective was it could look suspicious. So China was clearly aiming for some sort of reassurance from this summit, at least making clear its position on Taiwan. So that was the opportunity from the summit I think Beijing was looking at.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Maybe two things. On the Korean Peninsula issue, this time both the United States and China, once again, they emphasized the denuclearization of this peninsula. And what significance do you see in such a statement?
First of all, I think only the US readout included the phrase that both sides confirmed their shared goal to denuclearize North Korea. When you look at the Chinese readout, it only mentions that the two leaders exchanged views on the Korean peninsula, and there's no mention of denuclearization, And at a post-summit press conference, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson responded to a question about the US readout mentioning denuclearization. And the spokesperson didn't reject, the US position, but he reaffirmed China's stance that's quite different from what we saw from the US readout, which was that China remains committed to playing a constructive role in easing tensions, promoting political settlement, and safeguarding regional peace and stability. So, and there was no mention of commitment to denuclearizing North Korea. So in the context of U.S.-China coordination on North Korea, I'm cautious to sort of view it as view the U.S. readout as anything significant in my view, and this sort of has been the trend in recent years. China has refrained from publicly criticizing North Korea or supporting denuclearization, and historically China, has supported North Korean denuclearization as, part of the broader process to denuclearize the entire Korean peninsula, That's often been the Chinese rhetoric, and that's all in context of promoting stability near China's border, right? Which China sees as a core interest. So, as Jake mentioned, stability is China's core interest, but not denuclearization. And that's always been the gap between the Chinese side and the US-ROK Japan side, right? And so I think she may have agreed with Trump, maybe in their conversation, like in principle, that it would be nice to see North Korean denuclearization, right? That there would be an ideal long-term outcome. But that doesn't mean Beijing supports denuclearization as a practical goal. Like Beijing believes that efforts to denuclearize North Korea through pressure and coercion, have failed and have driven Pyongyang to be more aggressive in the region, which is against the Chinese sort of core interests in stability. So I think China will encourage and support US-North Korean dialogue and engagement when it happens, if and when it happens, right? But I don't see Xi Jinping pressing Kim Jong-un to return to denuclearization talks if that's what Trump is hoping for. At least the US readout says US remains committed to denuclearization. I don't know if that reflects Trump's own personal view, but Kim has already made it repeatedly very clear that denuclearization is never an option. So from Beijing's perspective, pressuring Kim, there's not so much incentive, right? Disincentives are a lot higher than incentive. You would probably only likely push Kim Jong-un and North Korea further away from China, which is probably not what she wants to see. But regarding the US readouts, emphasis on denuclearization, if there's any potentially meaningful implication, I think it's how that may affect Kim's sort of perception of Trump's diplomatic intent. Over the past year, Kim has, as he has shown openness to dialogue with Trump, right? But he attached a condition. Only if Trump is willing to explore a new negotiating framework that's not about denuclearization. So if Kim can look at the US readout and suspect that maybe Trump has maybe no genuine interest in talking, right? So, but as we all know, Trump can always change his position. he's not committed to like a principle, per se. So, and he exerts very strong influence on U.S. North Korea policy. Like a lot of people describe him as, the chair, like the North Korea policy desk at the State Department. Trump is a captain, right? A lot of people describe him that way. So I think the prospect of Trump-Kim talks, I think it remains to be seen.
And do you expect that Mr. Xi Jinping would actually visit North Korea and meet Kim Jong-un?
I'm not so sure either, but if she is planning on it, I think there are reasons why. As I mentioned earlier, looking at this whole framework of, new framework of, constructive strategic stability between the US and China, and looking at the summit readouts and the US readout mentioning denuclearization, and the Chinese readout also mentioning that both leaders exchanging views on the Korean Peninsula issues. So from Kim's perspective, it must be curious the views exchanged between Trump and Xi on North Korea. So Kim is probably seeking, I guess, some sort of update from Xi. At least he would want that. Xi, on the Chinese side, she also probably doesn't want this summit to cause any sort of misinterpretation by either Russia or North Korea. So I think there's plenty of incentive for Xi to meet Putin after Trump and meet Kim after these summits. Also, by doing that, Xi can signal to the rest of the region that this is something US cannot do. Like, I'm meeting US president, and right after that, I'm engaging with Russian president, and then I'm engaging with North Korean leader.
China wants to frame itself as a different kind of power than the United States. It portrays the United States as designating enemies and then building a bloc around them to isolate them and eventually, potentially, to go to war against them. And when they say that, there's a strong record of the United States doing exactly that. So if you look at the Middle East, the United States created its allies to isolate Iran and Iran's proxies. And eventually, when it felt like Iran was vulnerable, then it attacked Iran. And the same thing happened earlier against Iraq. And there were attempts to do the same thing against North Korea in the past, particularly in Trump's first term, the beginning of Trump's first term. And so, of course, China is very nervous about China itself becoming the focus of that kind of a bloc-building exercise. The one motivation of trying to stabilize the U.S. relationship is just to prevent that kind of bloc formation against China that could lead to very serious conflict. But then in this sort of regional diplomacy, as James said, this is also an attempt for China to show itself as a different kind of great power, a responsible great power. China always wants to make the point. We are rising in stature, and we're doing so in a responsible way. And the way they frame that often is, we are not trying to split the world into different blocks. We are trying to coordinate with everyone on shared interests. And for China to meet with Trump, and then to meet with Putin, and then to meet with Kim Jong-un, this is a way of kind of demonstrating we can talk to all sides, we can all work together, we all have shared interests that we should be pursuing together. And this is, sort of an attempt to show what kind of a great power China will be as it continues to grow.
The United States trying to make the bloc is actually, I think it started from the trade bloc, but it also has the security meaning as well. Building the trade bloc around the United States, would it be possible? I mean, would it really work? Does it sound realistic? In this regard, I'm not sure how serious the United States administration is working for. How serious are they? Because that's how the level of seriousness is, how the level of Korean companies need to follow.
Well, I think the Biden administration was very serious about
They were,
about the idea, but they also didn't feel like they had the kind of power to just push through all the opposition. And I think Trump does feel like he has the power to just break through anyone who is opposing him. And more or less that seems to have been the case in the domestic American political system anyway, and in the trade negotiations that he undertook with most countries after Liberation Day. But Trump, I don't think Trump himself is trying to build an anti-China bloc or a bloc to isolate, even Iran. Trump, I don't think Trump himself is trying to build an anti-China bloc or a bloc to isolate, even Iran, they may be doing that as a tactic in the war, but I think Trump just doesn't think systematically in that way or strategically. He just wants to dominate other people and then get something out of them. He doesn't want to create a system that will endure and institutionalize the hierarchy. He just wants a direct relation of domination. He wants to get something right now. And then he kind of wants to go on to something else. And maybe he'll come back and get something else later. So, and that's different for many people in his administration. Secretary Rubio, I think, Bridge Colby at the Pentagon. These people, they would like to have a system that dominates China. I think they would be willing to pursue an exclusionary bloc to get there. But they're not in charge. And so I think for the time being, there's going to be mixed messages from the United States. And some parts of the administration will say, we need you to agree to this, this, and this, and that's going to help us in the event of a Taiwan war or whatever. But for Trump, that's not a big priority. And if that kind of bloc formation becomes a danger to some of his other priorities, then I think he would shut it down. So it will really depend, I think, on how high profile the issue is. Because if it's a low profile issue, then people in the administration will handle, like lower levels will handle it, and they'll have some latitude to pursue their own preferences. But if it's a high profile issue, then Trump will make the decision, and then it will not be that sort of systematic bloc formation.
Going back to China issue, and do you think China is really deeply worried about this kind of approach from the United States?
They certainly are against it. It's just that I think that now they have the sense of confidence that the United States will have a hard time using it against them. I think the problem that does concern them is the way that the United States could use this against Chinese interests in third countries. And we saw that in the trade agreements that some countries in Southeast Asia made last year that basically gave the United States veto power over whether new Chinese projects could be pursued in those countries because it said that you couldn't have transshipment, and the definition of transshipment was very expansive, so it could include investments that built production in a country like Malaysia. So that's something that China has signaled. It finds that unacceptable, but it hasn't taken clear measures against it yet, or very, very minor ones. So that, I think, will be a place to watch as China puts together a system that it has a system that I think the leadership is now confident it can protect China internally, but China has interests all over the world. This Hong Kong company ran part of the port in the Panama Canal. There's a Chinese port in Peru that the United States has been complaining about. There's an astronomical observatory in Argentina that the United States is complaining about. There are Chinese mines all over Congo. So there are all these places that the United States has indicated it wants to push China aside. And it has started to do so in some cases. And China has said this is unacceptable. This is violating our interests. It's violating our right to development. So I think China will put together those countermeasures, and then sooner or later China will have to act, and then we will see how the United States responds.
What would be the meaning of this summit to Korean companies and Korean industry? What kind of impact they will have it? Maybe probably for semiconductor or car making or shipbuilding industries, or what else?
I think in the short term there should be a little bit greater stability and certainty, both Korea-China relations and U.S.-Korea relations. I think the most important thing for a Korean company's presence in the U.S. and China is that the U.S.-China relationship itself doesn't become split to the point where one or both countries start to force Koreans to choose one side or the other. And so if the U.S.-China relationship is stabilized, if there is a sense on the Chinese side that they feel confident in protecting themselves, and there's a sense on the U.S. side that they have to be careful about pressing China on these various issues, then that makes it less likely that either the U.S. or China will say to Koreans, you have to do what I say and stop listening to the other side. Otherwise, there's going to be serious consequences for you. So I think in the short term, it should be positive and stabilizing.
In the longer term?
In the longer term, the big question here is just whether is how badly the Iran war damages the global economy. This is the economic damage is hurting political leaders in Europe and Asia. Sooner or later, that's going to undermine their ability to win elections. So then there could be destabilizing new political currents that come into power. So I think longer term, what I'm looking at is the ways that the geopolitical disruptions are undermining both economic and political patterns, and whether that leads to intensive. I think it certainly will lead to more conflict. It's just a question where that conflict is and whether it's great powers or whether it's more internal to the countries that are being victimized.
I mean, long term, it's very unclear, right? But I think South Korea already has drawn the right lesson from this volatile US-China dynamic, very unpredictable, and particularly in the US, domestic politics being so unpredictable and, with policy inconsistency problem. I think South Korea already sort of has figured out what the long-term approach should be, which is de-risking and diversification of partnerships while trying to maintain, stable relations with both the US and China. So I think South Korea, yes, it has already sort of figured out how to respond to this, long-term challenge of volatile US-China relationship. Yeah.
May I ask you how you evaluate the status of US and ROK alliance relationship?
It's a very complicated
very
question, but
complicated.
I think US-ROK alliance remains fairly strong still and still highly functional. I mean, even as we are witnessing a lot of tensions and strains under Trump, at the same time, a lot of cooperation initiatives are still moving forward as business as usual in military, economic, and tech, all range of dimensions, right? So, but at the same time, the alliance is also in a period of complex transition and recalibration in a way. I think so on the one hand, the alliance is pivoting to sort of integrate economic and industrial cooperation and making that sort of strengthening that pillar of the alliance so that, to strengthen the long-term sort of sustainability of the alliance, right? And that can provide sort of the necessary glue to sustain the partnership years ahead. But at the same time, the alliance is also, it can be vulnerable to sort of drifting because there's also a lot of ambiguity, I think, surrounding US and South Korea's sort of strategic priorities, such as what's the purpose of US versus Korea as the US is sort of shifting focus on, the sort of first silent chain deterrence against China with the focus on Taiwan. US-FK General Bronson describing South Korea as a fixed aircraft carrier, constantly floating the idea of, US-ROK alliance as a counter to China, potential Taiwan contingency and all that. There's a lot of tension emerging and growing, sure. And also on the issue of long-term response to the North Korean nuclear threat, I think South Korea, at least many in Seoul, still, I think, hope that denuclearization can remain a goal that the two allies can pursue together, right? But I think in Washington, there seems to be more sort of emerging flexibility, I guess, trying to explore what the alternative is instead of denuclearization. So on these issues, I think there would have to be ideally tight, coherent policy coordination between Washington and Seoul to avoid sort of this alliance drifting. So those are the challenges that I see. Yeah.
May I ask your opinion about what's the arms control idea on the Korean Peninsula?
Recently, I'm seeing more people in Washington are sort of accepting the idea that we do need to search for an alternative approach that that can work, that can lead to at least something. Because right now, Korean Peninsula is so paralyzed, right? So paralyzed, so frozen, and nothing seems to be moving forward. And pursuing denuclearization, I mean, it's been pursued for decades and hasn't been really working. And there's really no evidence that it's gonna work if it has failed for how many decades now? 2-3 decades.
So you think that's kind of a realistic goal for?
I think it's more realistic, but at the same time, it can still be challenging because looking at the geopolitics right now, how desperate does North Korea look? Because arms control still means North Korea having to sort of agree to tie its own hands, you know, and make some sacrifice on deterrence, and how much incentive North Korea would see from that kind of idea, right? So I think a lot would depend on how much the US and South Korea would be willing to offer to North Korea. Yeah.